Good morning, Year 8. This is your feedback on the recent trenches quiz that you completed, and it was really interesting to see lots and lots of right answers to that. I was very pleased. So on this sheet you can see some of the things that most people did well, and one or two of what we've called misconceptions, and these are the things that perhaps some people are a little bit uncertain about. And then over on the far side, I've given you one or two of the keywords which have come up time and again in this unit. You can just check that you can spell them okay. So I'm just going to go through the answers and I'll remind you of what they were. So for question 1, it was the date for the Somme battle. And most of you got that right as July the 1st. I gave you 2 or 3 months to choose from. Now, why was the Somme so important? It's because it was the first big battle. And there were the hugest number of casualties on that very first day. And in fact, it took until November before that actual battle finished. It raged for 3-4 months through the summer and into the autumn, a tremendous loss of life. Somme is a river, I'm sure lots of you know that, but it's a really important battle in World War One. Now, question 2, I asked you about the British commander of the army, and most of you got that right. It was Douglas Haig. The options were Churchill. Now, he was actually in charge of the Navy. He was First Lord of the Admiralty at this time, and Lloyd George. And Lloyd George was a politician. Now, number 3, everyone got right. That strip of land that basically the two armies were fighting over was called No Man's Land. And that was a tragedy, wasn't it? They weren't able to move forward very quickly. And if you gained a few metres, then you probably lost it again in a later battle. And there was nothing in No Man's Land, just barbed wires, sadly bodies, craters from the bombing and the artillery. I think number 4 was the question about the tank. Now, this did confuse 1 or 2 people because both the rifle and the machine gun were invented, or were being used in the 20th century and the 19th century. So if any of you have heard of the Winchester rifle, which was the weapon that supposedly won the West in America, that was in regular use in the 1870s. So rifles were being used before the war. And the machine gun, although it was quite crude, had appeared in the 19th century, was used in the Boer War at the turn of the century. So the actual answer was the tank. The armoured tank was the new weapon. And it was first used in the Somme. I think it was the 15th of September, I've written here. 1916 was the first time an armoured tank went into battle. Now, number 5, there was some confusion, mostly between a telescope and a periscope. Now, if you go and look at task 3, where I think you drew a diagram where you looked at a cross-section of a trench, you will see that the periscope is the device that's got little mirrors in it, so you can stay in the trench and the periscope alone looks out across no man's land. Now, that avoids you getting your head shot off. Whereas if you did use a telescope, well, you'd have to put your head above the trenches. And, of course, the enemy would be watching for that, any sign of movement, and you'd be shot at. The next question was about shell shock. That was the answer that I was looking for. What was the mental condition? It was a name given to when people just mentally, their mental health wouldn't allow them to go on and they were shivering and shaking and in a distressed condition, unable to fight. And that phrase was coined in the First World War, shell shock, because of the constant noise of the artillery bombardments. We would call it post-traumatic stress today. Now, trench fever, I could understand why quite a few of you ticked that box, but that was actually a physical condition. That was where your feet had been sitting for so long in the muddy, wet, damp trench conditions that it was almost a sort of fungus. They died off. Your lower limbs would be in a really bad physical state. Number 7 was about the food, and I think most people realise that the fresh food, the fresh fruit I put, that would be the thing you were most unlikely to be able to access in the trenches. The rations, there were reasonably plentiful rations, were dried foods or tinned foods or even packaged foods. And of course, the soldiers could get food from home. They'd get chocolate, they might get tinned fish coming in food packages from their loved ones back home. The biggest irritant for number 8 in the trenches was actually the lice, because the lice would lay eggs in the seams of all your clothing, and there are stories how soldiers would try to put light a match and try to run it along the seams of their trousers and their outfits to see if they could burn out the eggs before they hatched into fleas and lice. But that was something they just couldn't get rid of, because there were rats in the trenches. It was unsanitary, it was unhygienic, and that's what the lice enjoyed. So that was the biggest irritant of all. Most of you did really well. You all knew what morale was. Well done. That this is lifting soldier spirits, finding some ways of keeping you upbeat and keeping you positive. And the last question that I asked about the letters, it was the biggest number. There's a variety of responses from you all, but 12 million letters a week would go to and from the home front, which was Britain, and the Western Front, which was the trenches. And soldiers and their families alike just longed to receive those letters and hear the news. And I think you'll remember from your learning that letters coming from the trenches were often censored. People would make sure there was no information in those letters that might lower morale back home or might give away some sort of location secrets. So your letters from these soldiers often got blacked out bits that have been censored. But the letters going out there, they just went out as they were from family and friends, and packages would go. 12 million letters a week is a huge number when you think they had to go across the channel on trains to get to the Western Front, in lorries and trucks to get to the trenches, and then somebody's literally going through the reserve trenches into the backup trenches to the front to deliver those letters. And you've seen pictures, photographs of soldiers sitting there reading the messages from home. So very well done, everybody. Most of you actually got most of those answers, if not all, right. So well done on your learning about the trenches, and I hope you've enjoyed doing your project for Task 7, choosing what you'd like to research. So that's all from me for the minute. I hope you all have a good day. Goodbye.